like, we talked about this before, just right before the show, but I think the tenor of this conversation would be more to do with like this crazy story of yours, this professional, this insanely, one side of the sort of Zionist machine is this kind of war on professionals and this kind of war on anyone who dares to like trample the line. So I was thinking we can kind of go over that. But for people who don't know you, Yipeng, thank you for joining the show. Sorry, this is my long-winded introduction. Um, Maybe you can introduce yourself. Some people will have remembered your story, but maybe you can sort of let us know about who you are and your work and the sort of wild story of, or and the quick version at least, because I imagine we'll get into it later, of what happened to you just right after after October 7th.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. So, my name is Yipeng Ge. I'm a family doctor and a public health and preventive medicine resident based in Ottawa. And I had the unique experience of being suspended and then welcomed back to the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Medicine, and then having I think, insight and clarity to not go back to a very harmful institution that willfully perpetuates and upholds anti Palestinian racism. And I also happen to be on the board for the Canadian Medical Association. This is the organization that represents physicians and medical learners nationally in Canada. And I resigned from that board in late December because of intimidation and bullying from senior leaders of that organization, based in racism and discrimination, that I've come to intimately understand as anti Palestinian racism. Through that arc of an experience, I've been supported through a community and communities of care, including meeting some tremendous humanitarian healthcare workers, including people like Dr. Ben Thompson, Dr. Tarek Lubani, Dr. Fozia Alvi, and have been welcomed into this community to focus and ensure that we're doing everything that we can to stop the genocide in Gaza and to center the Palestinians in Gaza that are going through the unimaginable. And so that is how I found myself working as a primary care doctor in Rafah and bearing witness to what was happening in Khan Yunis just around 2.5 weeks ago.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. I've been obviously following it since, because it was a big you were one of the early examples, I feel, your story. If like a lot of the sort of news version of these last 5 months are kind of like punctuated by certain things, and your story is obviously sort of reminds me of like the earlier aspect of all these, which is to say that like time is so nebulous now. And so, but it was an interesting case study in, the histrionics and the like hysterical lengths to which Zionists will go to make an example of anyone who doesn't carry water for them, who like and let alone, or I guess let me put it more precisely, who dares to challenge their representation of all of this. That like it's a weird, and that like these absurd theatrics of punishing people professionally. Meanwhile, I mean, we'll get to this, but you have this like bevy of doctors who are openly Zionists, say the most insane things online, who face zero professional repercussion. But we'll get into all this later. I mean, I guess at the outset, I think the one of those sort of remarkable aspects of your story is that they like it's like a kind of ironic turn of events, is that they tried to silence you, and like they tried to make an example of you and hurt you in like your pocketbook and in your career and in your CV, and it only inspired you to like increase your solidarity. So I think in some ways like it says something to your personality about like telling you what to do, which I guess is like something you want in a doctor, because you want like independence. So at the outset, I know that's not really a question, but how does it feel to be part of this weird, absurd theatrics? Like lots of people were saying what you said, and and like none of them got into like any kind of trouble. So is it a matter of just like a lottery that sometimes people win, of like Zionists just like pick your name out of a hat and say we're going to go after him just to make an example, or was there something in particular about you that they needed to make an example of?
I've had a lot of time to think about this, and you know, I think it is founded in of itself in anti-Palestinian racism and rhetoric and thinking that um, that someone who looks non-Arab, non-brown, non-Muslim, um, like quote unquote, should know better to fall in line with the status quo and to uphold systems of white supremacy, and including that of Zionism, um, is, I think, a large factor for how and why I was targeted. Um, you know, I was told to my face that people such as myself that are quote unquote unremoved from the or removed from the conflict, the decades long conflict in Palestine, um, should know better or should be better educated about the topic and issue. And I think their mistake here is that I am well educated as to what has been going on in Palestine since 1948, or even beyond that, before that, um, as I studied what happened in Palestine, and the healthcare impacts of colonization and the brutal occupation in the West Bank and the illegal blockade on Gaza on the healthcare system. I studied these things last year during my master's in public health, learning from human rights and a healthcare professional kind of lenses on health and human rights for Palestine. And I had the opportunity to also bear witness to what was happening in the West Bank and that of occupation and apartheid. And it is from actually exactly my work and framing in Indigenous health and anti-racism and decolonizing work in Canada that led me to learn more about how I can better present myself and position myself as an ally in doing solidarity work for Palestine. Um, and so it is this like really racist framing that it's all hands on deck to kind of take down anyone that brings further credibility to a movement for a free Palestine. Um, and I think there's also strategy behind, that someone that might not have deepened roots in this movement, they can be targeted, isolated, and attacked, and pushed aside to help a different narrative. And I think it is a mistake to know that there's actually amazing communities of care in the space of organizing for Palestine, that people will provide that care and support and love to protect one another from these unfounded, defamatory, and really, really harmful attacks on one's character and integrity.
Thank you for that. And I guess in some ways it's like the and I don't want to actually like go into this professional stuff so much because like I feel like the gravity of your trip to Gaza is like the importance of that like just makes us like dwarfs anything in terms of like what happens in like our professional lives. But at the same time though, part of the story here is to terrify you into towing the line. So yeah, this attempt to like go after you professionally and to like make you unhireable, and it's like specific. I would say it's like particularly targeted in specific fields. But I guess one sort of follow up question, and then we can kind of get. I feel like we should get to your trip. But the figure of like the doctor in our society is such a vaunted figure. Like they're these. I mean, like I hardly need to tell you this, but like they have this like aura of like superhumanity to them that like, and I guess there is a certain kind of truth in that insofar as like it costs so much to train doctors, but at the same time, like lots of things take a long time to get trained at. Like it's like I'm kind of like part of it's, but there, whether or not it's like some sort of class place thing or something about like the shape of our society that puts this figure on doctors specifically, but that it felt so urgent to come after you because, yeah, as you said, you are the part of like the fetishization in Canada. We do have this kind of liberal diversity game. So if you can like help diversify the like staff photo, you're pushed into this like, which is like this absurd theatrics that like white supremacy and this like neoliberal stage has put us all into. So I guess in some ways making an example of you um, helps in that endeavor to say like, hey, you better shut the fuck up or toe the line, or because if you don't do that, then you'll see what happens to you. We'll see how comfortable you remain. And so I guess in some ways, like, you know, and really this is a question about like how do you feel your profession has come with you on this question? Like on the whole, are you surprised by the reactions you've heard at like I guess what would you say is the best way to describe your professional class, your fellow doctors, your colleagues at least, or healthcare professionals in general? Is there a way to just would you be able to sort of generalize them as a class of people in terms of their political like vocality, let's say? Or which is to say, like, do they skew conservative? Do they skew liberal? Is it like, you know, and if there's no real way to classify them, what would you say in terms of like anecdotally? Do you feel like your position has been like validated in any way?
Well, medicine is an incredibly conservative and structurally violent place. If we, and like in its institutions as well. Like if we think just a couple decades back, and still ongoing actually, there's a lot of violence and structural racism that is perpetuated by medicine as an institution. If we just think about its ability to uphold systems of oppression and racism through validating things like eugenics or the nutritional experimentation on indigenous children, or forced sterilization of many different groups and ethnicities of peoples. Medicine is an extremely harmful institution, and so does not and has never surprised me that it's been incredibly conservative and has been really slow to change and have the change in leadership that we need to see. There's certainly a ceiling as to how racialized folks are able to tap into positions of authority or power within medical institutions. And for the most part, I've operated within these institutions to do health equity, anti-racism, and decolonial work in health and healthcare with some success. But what has been really clear as day now is the Palestine exception certainly remains the case within these really harmful institutions that continue to uphold that of white supremacy and Zionism.
There was, but there was a thing you said on the Fulcrum podcast that I saw, and it was about basically you connected a kind of more, I mean, maybe like kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of not fulsome, but a more what's the word? I don't know. It's like in my brain. Um, Anyways, okay, I'll figure it out later. But essentially, like you mentioned, you basically linked the Palestine question to the story of settler colonialism here in Canada, right? And so it feels like part of the reason why they went after you with such gusto is that you do articulate that link, that this is a global, that the Palestine story is a global story of settler colonial sort of violence that like that Canada is like also deeply, deeply entrenched in on like and so I feel that this has become one of the sort of the most dangerous specters is that people talking and making this link more and more because at the end of the day, it does expose Canada for like what it is. Like Canada is its own version of Israel, or the other way around is true too. That Israel is its own version of Canada, and if not mirror images, then I guess another metaphor could be useful. Like I always say, kind of like branches, different branches of like the same tree, uh, and like that historical connection is so important to make because it destabilizes all sort of like debates in Canada around this or that and everything because like the fundamental dislocation of peoples of indigenous peoples that this country is like founded on, right? Like that's a Palestine story too, right? And so like recognizing that or articulating that connection, it feels like you were a little too loud on that stuff in particular. That it was like one reason to sort of to go at you personally.
I mean, I think the funny thing that I find about it is um, I don't think I was being too loud. I think I was holding back quite a bit, and I think I was self-censoring quite a bit um, up until early November when I received my suspension. Um, I don't know how many people know this, but I was sharing social media posts on my Instagram, as I think a lot of people were, because it's an outlet for self-preservation. We're seeing what's happening in Gaza and seeing it for what it is. Within days of October 7th, I think it was like a day or even a day and a half in, there were 3,000 killed or injured. And the bed capacity for Gaza as a whole is, I think, 1,500 or something along those lines. So the healthcare system was completely over capacity already a day and a half or 2 days into the escalation of conflict. And anyone who understands history, anyone who's like picked up a history book and learned about Palestine, knew that it did not start on October 7th and knew that the backlash with the rhetoric of what was coming and with the rhetoric that was pushed by Israeli officials at the highest levels was that we were going to see a genocide. They made it clear with their own language. And for anyone to not see that is either from a place of ignorance or from a place of perpetuating racism and bias and dehumanization of Palestinian lives. And in, I think like, and I think like any kind of work, any solidarity work in this space needs to come from a place of understanding our own identity and our own privilege. And on the flip side of that coin is how oppression affects the way in which we can also authentically present ourselves and be present for solidarity work. And I'm calling in from traditional, unceded, unsurrendered, and stolen Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, which is also known as Ottawa. And it is from exactly that positioning that, as a Canadian, as a Chinese Canadian, I have benefited from this stolen land. I've benefited from the genocide of Indigenous peoples of Canada and the ongoing impacts of that medical and structural racism. And I have been doing everything that I can within my own training and work as a primary care doctor and as someone who trains and works in public health to try to dismantle those systems, because it's my duty and obligation if I call myself, an ally or an accomplice in this space of anti-racism or decolonial work. And then because of that framing, or anyone who sees themselves as wanting to right the wrongs of the past and the present, then we have to do everything in our power to change the future, for recreating and co-creating that world that we see that is more just, more equitable, that actually stands for health and human rights for any person in this world. And so what I mentioned about self-censorship is it's interesting how they went after me when they did, because I've never been criticized for Palestine before November 5th, when I got that phone call in the morning on a Sunday. And the people that made that decision to suspend me from the university were four people that I knew, four people that I've also worked with in different capacities, because I do leadership work within the university. I've done leadership work as a medical student. Did leadership work as a resident. I even co-created and worked on their anti-racism curriculum for the family medicine program. I sit on the faculty council for the university, which is the highest governing body for the faculty of medicine, chaired by the dean of medicine. I know these people, and yet they still chose to do what they did to me. And then for them to come back and to not even acknowledge what they've done to me, and what precarious harm others experience by seeing what happened to me. And on top of that, being at faculty council, other cases of suspensions, threatened expulsions were discussed. And the blatant anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian hate that was spewed in those meetings without any condemnation until I spoke up was just appalling, unprofessional, to come from anyone, let alone these are people that hold authority positions within the medical institution that trains future doctors and other healthcare professionals, for that matter, here in Ottawa. And if this is an institution that, in their different policies and in their outward public statements, say they do not tolerate bullying and harassment, that they do not tolerate racism or discrimination of any of its forms, that's not what I'm seeing. That's not what I've experienced. And so it became clear as day that I cannot continue to uphold such an institution from the inside. There's no more further work I could do from the inside, because my time and energy and patience is not unconditional and is limited, as is anyone's. And so, I really realized that, I do work in the space of anti-racism. And so it's important to acknowledge that discomfort is not the same as harm, abuse, or even inflammatory language or conversation. Talking about racism and bias is uncomfortable. That is a lot of what I want to be working on. But when people do not own up to their own mistakes, that of perpetuating racism and bias and discrimination, then that's not something I can see myself being a part of. But there's so much conflation in this whole genocide, right? The conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, and also this conflation of a lack of safety or feeling unsafe with what is actually just uncomfortable conversation. Like, we need to be able to have the uncomfortable conversations about settler colonialism, about Zionism as systems of oppression for the Palestinian people, in the same way that we've had conversations and continue to have conversations that are uncomfortable about racism and structural racism in the context of Indigenous peoples and the genocide that took place in Canada. And for people to not even link those interconnected issues is deeply problematic and alarming, because we are, coming up on 5 months of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and there's still so much silence in these institutions.
Thank you for that. Well, we should probably get to that, because you have seen this genocide up close. I mean, I imagine, I guess at the outset, and I've seen a little bit of what you discussed, but I guess at the outset, like, how it was very recent. You came back like 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks. When did you come? You came, yeah. And so I imagine it's still very recent. I mean, let me put it this way. I still like I have a running tally of clips, like a weird kaleidoscope of clips that like in my brain of like scenes of devastation from Gaza, and that's just through what I've seen on my phone. So I can't even like begin to imagine like what you must have seen in terms of the scale of what this annihilation war is, and also to see what this intentional genocidal war on Palestinian health infrastructure and the ability to like maintain life. You saw it up close. I mean, I guess at the outset, like, how do you ever recover from seeing something like that? Like, do you?
Yeah, I don't know if I ever will, because I don't think it's normal um, for anyone to experience what I experienced, for the Palestinians in Gaza to continue to experience what they've experienced, and also for what they've experienced, for a lot of them, all of their lives, their entire lives of being under siege in Gaza, because there were bombs dropping before October 7th, and then the bombs that dropped after October 7th were in much more intensity and impact. Um, but the people that have survived and struggled to survive the ongoing Nakba, um, honestly, I do not know how um, the perseverance, the resilience, the healing that is necessary to move forward. It's hard to imagine when the ongoing genocide continues, but when and if um, the killing stops, this intentional genocidal violence stops, then I think we can begin to heal, like all of us. Um, and it is possible. It doesn't feel possible right now, but it is possible because I've seen, bear witness, and heard the testimonies of residential school survivors who have survived the genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and their testimony, sworn testimony, to help create the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. And there are 94 calls to action there that institutions and individuals need to be accountable for. But to be able to get to something like reconciliation and reparations, and a pathway forward for equality and justice, we need truth telling. And we're not even seeing that right now. We're seeing the continued lies and propaganda that continue to dehumanize Palestinians and their struggle for liberation. So until we can get the facts straight and agree on those facts, then there's no healing, because it's very much a fight and a struggle for liberation. And for anyone that is able to do the work of bearing witness, including going and supporting the healthcare efforts and relief efforts on the ground, there is that really important privilege of using that privilege and leveraging that privilege to not only bear witness, but also move beyond the despair and hopelessness to action, including anything and everything that we can be doing to call attention to the root causes of the disease and suffering that has affected the Gaza Strip since its creation, including acknowledging the conditions in which things were not fine and dandy even before October 7th in Gaza. I was speaking to someone about the long-term impacts of severe malnutrition and on children in Gaza. And it's even hard to even think about the long-term impacts, including that of stunted physical growth and stunted cognitive growth, including learning disabilities, as well as having increased risk of having dementia as an adult for these children. Because there are so many children that are just dying from starvation and dehydration now in the double digits. And I'm sure it's going to be in the triple digits soon because of the continued blockade, intentional blockade of aid on the land borders. But it dawned on me that a lot of the children that I did meet in Rafah, in this, more quote unquote safer zone, but we know nowhere is safe, because we heard the bombs dropping around us almost on a daily basis, was that these children were looked to me to be like 4, 5, 6 years old, that were following me around the clinic because, I look so different, kind of like felt like a zoo animal at times, but in the best of ways, because people were so kind and joyful to see someone who didn't look like them and didn't talk like them. But one of the healthcare workers, the staff, told me, no, I know these kids. They're not the age that you think that they are. They're actually 10, 11, 12. And so these kids have experienced a consequence of the quote unquote Gaza diet that they were put on by the Israelis much in advance of October 7th. And so the long-term consequences of severe malnutrition is not just from this genocide. It's from the ongoing Nakba. And so I recognize what I went to go help with and support people on the ground with, like, healthcare efforts, and bared witness to an ongoing genocide, is awful. But so is everything that has taken place, since the ongoing Nakba began. All of it has been systematic and intentional to ethnically cleanse, to destroy the Palestinians as a people and as a collective, and their culture, their language. And we see these efforts in many different contexts, through structural oppression, that of imperialism, colonialism, and what is happening in Gaza is probably something I will never forget, and is the worst of the worst because of how it's been documented, and because many of the horrific crimes against humanity, including that of genocide, have more or less not been documented in the way that Gaza is being documented right before our eyes. And so recognizing that difference, of course we need to heal. Of course we need to find ways to, like, take care of each other and still bear witness. But, for decades upon decades, there have been Palestinians at the center of this that have known right from wrong, or have been demanding their basic human rights and dignities to be respected, and their self-determination to be respected, including their right to return. And I am humbled to be a part of that movement, to be a part of recognizing their humanity, and to recognize them as humans, because so many in this world who hold authority and power fail to do just that. That is actually probably what the worst part about this is. Yes, what I've seen in Gaza, the forced starvation of children, so many children that I looked after in the clinic, we couldn't even offer them food or water. And that's what they needed to get better from their communicable diseases. Over 90% of children under the age of 5 have one or more infectious diseases, which is essentially more or less a death sentence if you already have the overlapping crises of food, clean water, and shelter insecurity. and all we had in that clinic was IV fluid to give some of these children, which only introduces another source of infection, which only introduces more trauma and pain and suffering for the child and the parent that has to be exposed to that. And the clinic didn't have any antibiotics, and we brought a supply of antibiotics to start prescribing. But when we were there were only 14 medical teams that were not locally based, international medical teams supporting the efforts on the ground in Rafah and Khan Yunis. And in the majority of the population, 1.5 million people are in Rafah. Like this is not a solution. There is no humanitarian solution. It's doing what we can within our power, but it's the authority figures, it's the people with so much political power who choose not to wield it because they do not see Palestinians and their struggle for liberation, and to be humanized. And so, yes, what I saw was horrific beyond words, but it continues, and so I must continue. So must us all, until it is, until there's a ceasefire, until the forced starvation efforts are quashed. Then I don't think any of us can even begin to start to think about what does healing look like.
I appreciate that answer, Yipeng. I really do. I guess in some ways I wanted a kind of like segue to talking about this stuff, because I feel at a certain point like there is just a kind of, for someone like you, something like just bearing witness, there's a kind of memoir like role for you, in the sense that like these images, the worst images of the devastation are like purposely being kept from most mainstream news. And in some ways, the basic act of going there and showing yourself and using your eyes as like a weapon, forget like what you could do in a hospital, but like just being there and like bearing witness, like that is a form of solidarity. And I guess like the easiest way maybe to talk about this in terms of like the logistics of arrival even in Gaza. How like how quickly was this turnaround between your decision to go and when you landed?
I had made the decision to go probably in late December, early January, through a couple of conversations that I had with people like Dr. Tarek Lubani and Dr. Fozia Alvi. And so we were put on a list through Dr. Tarek Lubani's organization called GLIA to try to enter. We were supposed to enter around February 4th. And ultimately things were delayed, and we got notice that we were allowed to enter Rafah through the Rafah border crossing on February 12th. And we probably got that notification about 7 or 8 days before entering. So it was quite last minute to get everything ready to leave Canada, get to Cairo, and prepare for our entry. So everything was quite last minute, and a lot of the situation still remains the same, because it's, I think, very strategic on the authorities' part to make the process challenging and difficult to organize, so that it dissuades people from doing it entirely.
And just the actual like being in Gaza, like how the sounds of the bombs, to me, for instance, like I don't know, this is a weird, I guess this is like strange thing to say, because it's for me, it exists purely on a phone, right? So it's like, but it's the detailedness of the images, and like the ability, like how raw the images are, at least in viewing it, and the sounds of it. And especially there was like a phase where you could see the lights going out like dimmer and dimmer, especially at the beginning when there were still the generators were still working in Gaza. So as things got darker and darker and the booms like got louder, I mean, I guess my first question is like, and I guess this is like a weird thing, is like, do the sounds like ever like what are they like what's it like to be in war? I mean, what's it's a ridiculous question to say out loud.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been in an active war zone. Um, it's very much an active war zone, but it's also not a war. It's genocidal violence, and so um, yeah, we knew going in that anyone could become a target and is a target. Um, and so certainly we had kind of those reflections and conversations about uh, acknowledging that there's a real possibility that we wouldn't be coming back should we enter. Um, and so very early on too, we started to recognize and report back on the sounds, so that there was a Canadian team, small but mighty team, including Dr. Tarek Lubani, who was monitoring the security situation for us. Um, and so we quickly were able to figure out what were all the sounds that we were hearing, the buzzing of the drones to the different airplanes and like different fighter jets that would be in the air um, that could drop bombs, and the different sounds of bombing or a missile strike, which would be different as well. And quickly we learned from the locals like what all these different sounds we were hearing throughout the day were. And sometimes I would learn from the children, because they'd be able to point to me something in the sky and tell me that that would be a surveillance drone, or that would be a drone that actually can fire like a bomb or a missile or something like along those lines. um, and we were in um, one of the doctors' homes, which is not really their home because they've been displaced. It was just kind of like a makeshift classroom, makeshift home in a classroom. And we were having some conversation with them, including their family. And we heard the whistling sound of a missile followed by a loud explosion. Then that shook the entire building, including the glass panes of the room that we were in. And we were completely taken aback by that experience. I didn't say it at the time. I said it to my colleagues afterwards when we debriefed in the evening, that I thought we were going to die in that moment, just by how loud that explosion. Well, first of all, you couldn't really miss such a distinct like whistling sound, um, followed by a very loud explosion. Um, you don't know if that was the only one that would land or if it's going to be followed by further ones. But even just how the proximity of that first sound, missile landing, like it could have been it for us, but this is the reality that the folks on the ground in Gaza have been living through for like all of their lives. And the children sitting across from me, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, they didn't flinch, they didn't blink an eye when that missile landed and exploded. The doctor just explained, this is what we've been living through, not for months, for years, for decades. And we were like, well, what do you think it hit? What was it? And we were at the European Gaza Hospital, and it's well known that they were taking out the residential buildings around the hospital to make the place unlivable. And it's already unlivable. Like there are people, displaced people, living in the like open grounds areas around the hospital. There are people living in the hallways of the hospital, and the stairwells of the hospital. Like they have their like the little belongings that they have with them. All of that is just in the hallways of the hospital because there's no safe place left. And we've known this for months. And even these hospitals, they eventually get targeted. Like all of the northern hospitals, including the central area, and now Western Khan Yunis, like Nasser Hospital, all those hospitals have been attacked to some extent or been completely um, made non-functional because of ground invasions, because of people being arrested at gunpoint, told to evacuate at gunpoint. And so patients have just died in these hospitals because they need oxygen, they need like supportive care, young, and you know this, like young newborns that need like pediatric uh, care in these like ICU or like NICU supportive environments. Those young newborns have been just completely left to die, um, and 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 so I think a lot about the moral distress of the healthcare workers that have to choose between their life, leaving behind these patients of theirs, knowing that they will die, or do they stay and preserve their dignity, integrity for their professional work, and their duty for their patients, knowing that staying back endangers their life and they might be killed, they might be detained, arrested, and then tortured and then killed. And then they're not able to serve any more patients because they're dead. I I have so much respect for the healthcare workers that continue to do what they do, despite knowing everything that we know now. And I'm sure they know so many more examples because of the stories that have also not been told, that haven't been able to be told, because we can only hear as much as what people are able to tell. And there are so many people that are just buried under the rubble that haven't been able to be rescued. And because of the lack of like sustainable electricity or access to the internet and cellular connection, there are just so many stories that will be untold at this point. And so for sure there's a role for anyone to document and bear witness. But I think the moral distress is catastrophically large at this point.
I appreciate the depth and the honesty of your answer. I imagine there's like a part of like the human brain that reaches towards like leaving these experiences and just kind of like narrating them in a linear fashion, or just picking like specific memories and like turning them into anecdotes, which are like totally like acceptable ways for our brain. But like to look at the globality of this violence, how deep Zionist terrorism goes, that it's not just like bombs, it's not the like bullets, it's not the landmines, that it's down to like the cellular level, that the attack on like healthcare and the attack on like the life itself of a Palestinian, that is so, to me, like this has always been a genocidal war. It's just after October 7th they ramped it up to a degree we've never seen before. And so in some
Mm-hmm.
ways, like the for me, I've like, over the course of these like 5 months, I found myself like going up and down in terms of my ability to like consume these images. That like some days I'll like look more closer than others, if only because it's a weird like mental health thing. It's not that weird, obviously it makes sense, but like in the sense that, but bearing witness, I imagine, and like going there and seeing that, and but also meeting the people, because the people you must have met, and you've alluded to a few so far, like this is the kind of heroism that like we never get in our like we can only imagine in our fictions, right? Because our societies, like, are
Mm-hmm.
neoliberal hellholes. They're made into like, we're individualized, atomized, we're like founded on this like act of genocide. So in some ways, like heroism to us that the Palestinians must have in their like normal lives, so like surrounding them, is something truly rare for us. And I feel that oh, this is almost
Mm-hmm.
trite to say, but you must have met so many like giant people in this trip, that like you'll always remember, and like the trauma goes, like the traumas that we exist and like that we collect as human beings, like in some ways, I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this, but like they are paired with these moments of like, wow, did I just like remember that story? Wow, that person is like quite something. Like, oh, did you hear her? Like the voices of people, like how they interacted with people, like how people laugh, like these little details that are almost like a narrator, like they
Mm.
stick with us. And so I guess in some ways my next question is like, in that time you were there, you must have forged some amazing, if not like short-lived connections with people. Maybe are there a few that stick out in your mind and like how you tell it?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I think that's like a beautiful way to put it. I think like sometimes through really trying or stressful times, to put it lightly, um, you forge really strong bonds and relationships because there's a shared experience um, of adversity and finding a path forward in sharing things like laughs and smiles, um, and food and drink and being in community with one another, um, despite knowing everything that is going around, everything that's horrible that's going on around you, and that kind of like bond and support is ultimately how we heal, is like in community with one another. um, some of the folks that I met, they are certainly my heroes, and I am so grateful to be connected with quite a few of them still, and getting updates about how they're doing. Some of them have actually, so like a lot of the people that we met were the doctors and the nurses in the clinics, but a lot of the other support staff, and almost all of whom, my understanding is that they've been um, not paid for any of this work. They're volunteers, because the civil infrastructure has so completely collapsed. And so um, my heart remains there in thinking about their safety, their family safety, and how they kind of continue to do this work. Um, but I've certainly been in touch with quite a few of them. One of them is a doctor who also recently finished their training. I learned that they actually successfully got to Cairo, um, but the challenging part is their family is still in Rafah. Um, I mentioned the other doctor who we spent time with, and meeting their family, and that was incredibly beautiful and moving. That we've been um, given the generosity and compassion and kindness of sharing food and drink with some people, knowing how scarce food and drink are. We went in with the sole intention of being entirely self-sustainable, with bringing in all our food and water, um, and yet these beautiful moments of sharing space and community with food and drink was just something touching and healing for me that I will carry with for the rest of my life. There was a interaction in a very, very busy clinic that I was working in. We typically saw 60, 70 patients in a half day. Um, and the local doctor, who's also not a local doctor because he's been displaced from the north, has family members killed, and is living in a tent, is doing this work. He typically actually sees like 200 patients in this clinic, so we were slowing him down. But nevertheless, when I was in this clinic, after a couple of hours, they put a bowl of like hot lentil soup in front of me as I was like seeing patients, like urging me to eat and to keep my energy up so I could see more and more patients. Um, and at that point, it's just so beautiful to um, have some of these, experiences that I will surely remember for the rest of my life, and how healing it was, to be surrounded by such generous and kind people despite everything that they've gone through and despite everything that they continue to go through. And so, yeah, as reluctant as we were to, decline food, there are some moments like that where, a bowl of hot lentil soup gets put in front of you in the middle of clinic. You just can't refuse that act of generosity. And so it's these really special moments that have been also healing for me, considering the things that I went through in the months preceding to find myself in Rafah. And I think the last thing on this train of thought is, like the opportunity to share community and space was something that a lot of the Palestinian healthcare workers and other folks that we met, they wanted to do more, actually. Like it was heartbreaking because they wanted to actually cook for us, like cook a proper meal. They wanted to show us their home that has been destroyed. They wanted to show us the belongings that they cherished, the places in Gaza that they cherish. We were able to do some of this through photos on their phone. They showed us, that time they went to the beach with their kids, like the travels that they would go on to visit other parts of Gaza. So much of Gaza is just completely destroyed, to the point of like being like unable to recognize so many parts of like northern and the middle part of Gaza. And so but they wanted, they really wish that they could actually show us their home, these places that matter so much to them. And so it hurt them that they couldn't do this for us because it's either been destroyed or it's just not safe to travel around and see different parts of Gaza, because there's no safe place in Gaza. And it doesn't take anyone any effort truly to recognize that Palestinians are humans, right? But so much of the rhetoric, so much of the hate and propaganda continues to do just that. And so when we think about why that is, who does that serve? I think we all need to be super critical as to not only why does this happen to Palestinians, but why does this happen to a lot of different groups and peoples in this world? Who does it serve? So that was a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's what I've been struggling a lot, knowing that I'm back in Canadian society, which is complicit. The Canadian government is complicit in the ongoing genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. And the folks that I left, they know this. They know that I left, and they're worried about my safety as I was leaving. They're still worried about me as I'm worried about them. Think about their humanity and compassion as they're worried about me now, because they know I've seen what I've seen there, and they know that I'm coming back to a society and a government, like a structural environment that is deeply violent and complicit in the genocide and demise of their community and peoples. And so to kind of return to that is so psychologically harmful, not because of what I bared witness to alone in Gaza, but because I have to find a way as a human to operate within a system that seems so structurally violent. Well, it is so structurally violent. And that is something that that kind of like readjustment or reintegration is something that I've struggled with in terms of how it actually fits into everything. Like I think there's a degree of I shouldn't fully readjust. I shouldn't fully reintegrate. Otherwise, that's complicitness and complacency. And it's not just reverse culture shock. Reverse culture shock is when you visit a place, that place has a different culture and language and norms, and you come back and you're like, oh, okay, like the place that now I'm in has different cultures and norms. This is going to visit a place, do some work, bear witness to a genocide, come back to a place, that place is actually supporting said genocide. And so I want to hold so much space for everyone that is also doing that work of bearing witness from Canada, from anywhere else in the world, and struggling to be a human, a true human that acknowledges health and human rights, and still finding a way to operate within these really harmful structures and systems and societies that uphold capitalism and imperialism and colonialism against all odds, it seems, still. That is the work that we're all doing and carrying, and it's easier when we share it together, including spaces like this where we're able to talk through it and also hold each other in that experience.
Thank you for that. I guess this is this is the kind of sister question to my previous one, or at least the one that I pair with. Is that like what the can you provide either anecdotally or a kind of, or just if you want, you can just give us the example, the illustrations, or the details, at least whatever details come to mind, of the scale of the collapse of the Palestinian health infrastructure. I mean, you alluded to it earlier in terms of like only being able to give IV fluids, but what must have been like apocalyptic scenes.
I think like for months we've been talking about like a crumbling or like a failing healthcare system in Gaza. And essentially what I saw while I was there was that there's no system. It's just left in pieces at this point. There's no good way to get patients like follow up for the surgeries that they've had. Some of the patients that I saw in clinic, they still have their external fixator devices, like an orthopedic device, after they've had a surgery on their bones because it's been totally blown apart because of an airstrike. So a surgeon had to put it back together. And these devices remain in after they were actually seen at a place like Al Shifa Hospital and then had to be evacuated. So then they got seen at Al Nasser Hospital. But then that hospital was under attack while we were there and now is non-functional. So there's no way for them to get appropriate follow-up. And they were having wound infections on top of all that. So we were seeing efforts to try to like bring together like more medical points, which are essentially like pop-up primary care clinics to kind of do the most basic of things. And there are these really important efforts that are happening on the ground. But how do we expect the healthcare system to do its work when, like, what seems to be, every week or every 2 weeks, we see another hospital be attacked and destroyed, and healthcare workers arrested and detained and tortured en masse? It is impossible to even think about planning the healthcare system and planning how patients can be triaged and be seen when this level of targeting of healthcare infrastructure has been so severe. There's When I was there 3.5 weeks ago on the ground, the WHO sent us a report on the attacks on healthcare alone, documenting the number of attacks on personnel, documenting the number of attacks on infrastructure. And I can send that to you, but it's, now it's like 3-4 weeks out of date. I think the problem with even just showing the mass scale of the destruction of the healthcare system is that this is not a healthcare system issue alone. They've destroyed critical infrastructure, like a lot of civilian infrastructure, including like plumbing and sanitation, like potable water. They've destroyed universities en masse. They've targeted and hit and made all those universities pretty much non-functional. No one has been in school since October 7th, and there's been no electricity for the most part of Gaza since October 7th. And so what we're seeing now is like a complete collapse of societal infrastructure. There is no infrastructure that is keeping things going. People are keeping things going because they care about one another. But there are also, even when I was there, reports of civil unrest and the UN wanting to document this more for the safety of their workers to kind of deliver aid. We saw, I think in January, what had happened to one of the trucks that was delivering aid to the north. It got completely swarmed by people because they are in survival mode. You cannot fault people for just trying to survive. They're doing their best to find food and water for themselves and their children. And we continue to fail them. Like, there are children that are just skin and bones and dying in the north. And I saw patients in the south that were also skin and bones and on the brink of death. And so I'm worried that those patients are dying or will be dead in a matter of days. And so when we talk about the healthcare system, there's no healthcare system solution. There's no humanitarian solution, because this has been a genocide since we started, since all this started. So, but I certainly am continuing my efforts with my colleagues to bring in delegations of doctors, and trying to match the needs for what are some of the nurses, what are some of the pharmacists and doctors needing in terms of supplies to do their work. A lot of it is medications, but sometimes it's the most basic of things. Like, they need shoes, they need scrubs, because they haven't had a change of shoes or scrubs in like 3, 4, 5 months. And so we are doing our best in bringing in these doctors through delegations. We're sending in a 4th delegation in a couple of days now. And so constantly in touch with folks on the ground as to what the needs are. But the challenge is the needs are so great, like everything is needed. We brought in things like diapers and baby formula, to medications and supplies, but everything is just so absolutely needed because everything has been destroyed. The intention, why we call it a genocide, for many different reasons, but one of which is the conditions have been made entirely unlivable. And so when you're in an environment like that and there's no way out, because those that even want to leave, they can't leave. And then those that want to leave and have the means to are like fundraising upwards of like $5,000, $10,000 per person to leave. And even those that have the cash get put on a list and they wait sometimes weeks to try to leave. Yes, but the healthcare system continues to be under immediate threat. We spoke with colleagues on the ground just this morning, and there's an imminent worry and threat for a ground invasion in Rafah. And not only would that be catastrophic for the population, but it would mean that the healthcare workers and the infrastructure in Rafah would also become direct targets, because we've seen what has happened to the healthcare infrastructure in every part beyond Rafah. And there still continues to be like bombing around the hospitals, such as at European Gaza. So yeah, I don't know what further we all need to see until we truly have an awakening, so that we can end the senseless violence.
Yipeng, it's been over an hour that I've kept you. I really appreciate the honesty in all your answers, the brutality. I mean, it must be. I can't imagine it's easy to like revisit these things over and over again, as you must be doing on these shows. But I appreciate this time and your ability to just like talk about this stuff in such a lucid manner. Like I would, first of all, I would not have the moral strength to make it through med school, let alone residency, let alone to like make it as a doctor, because it's very hard. You know, I understand the kind of ideological overlay that we've turned doctors into, but it is a very difficult profession. And the fact that like you did it in literally the worst place on earth. So there must be a strange disconnect, because as you did mention, we are in the place that supports this like racist genocidal war, and that like, you know, turns a blind eye, and like I can't help, and I know I don't hold this at the feet of like indigenous organizers at all, but when I see signs that say every child matters these days, I think that like clearly that's not true. Like that's never been true. And I understand that like phrases are meant to like remind people, and like they're not supposed to be literal expressions of historical truths. And like they do have a kind of aspirational tone. I understand that. But the fact that like our Canadian political class and our media class just, you know, blithely covers all this up, or just, you know, maybe they'll mention, you know, in abstract ways the starvation or stuff like that. But like, you know, the fact that like you aren't like on the cover of every magazine and like your story, and you know, you have to like go on these like small nobody podcasts like mine. Like there is an active attempt to like hide this genocide. So I guess in some ways, like it must be surreal to come back here and pick up where you. I mean, not pick up exactly where you left off, but to continue working, because you know you gotta do something, right? You can't just like sit and.
Yeah, I feel like I learned pretty early on in the past couple of weeks that it does no one good for me to just kind of retreat and kind of stew and be angry or be like super down and depressed, um, because there's so much work to be done, and this not all the work is for me to do, but the work of showing up and in solidarity, it continues. It's a lifelong work, and actually, I intimately know this work because I've been doing for years, actually over a decade now, because of what I learned about uh, Indigenous health and racial disparities in the context of so-called Canada. And so I deeply understand and acknowledge that the world has always been this way, and but it doesn't mean it has to continue to be the way that it always has been. And so that's what allows me to keep going, is knowing that there are people in this world that will disrupt and challenge the status quo and see it for what it is. Acknowledge that it's not broken because it was never meant to serve certain people and communities. But what will we do about it? Like freedom and liberation and human rights, they are never handed to anyone in this world. We've seen that from various social movements and like rights movements around the world. We have to demand it. We have to fight for it. And we have to recognize that we have to do everything within our power in recognizing sometimes the privilege that we hold, the uncomfortable privilege of, bearing witness and feeling like, oh, we can, turn off the TV or disconnect and not. But I think we need to push beyond that discomfort and actually start co-creating the communities and the societies that we actually want to see. And all of that actually starts locally. Like we need to start emulating what we actually want to see in our communities by demonstrating it to our neighbors, demonstrating it to our friends, and welcoming people in and calling people in about why they are so afraid to talk about Palestine and challenging those that internalized anti-Semitism and racism, and pushing beyond these harmful narratives that have been continued to uphold the ongoing Nakba. I think what also keeps me going is knowing the hope and the resilience, and the joy that Palestinians in Gaza had shared with me when I was there. And there's a moral duty and obligation for all of us to do everything within our power to support them, and to stand with them in solidarity. I think my work has always been about my patients and the communities that I care about, the communities that have so graciously and humbling me by welcoming me into their space, and that is healing me and bringing a lot of motivation for me to keep going. And I'm still looking after patients in Canada, and because they were my patients before I went, and I have an obligation with them, and that's why I also had to come back and take care of them. And knowing that, like, taking care of one another in all of its forms, like, you don't have to be a doctor to take care of the next person or loved ones. You just have to be a human that actually sees the humanity in others. We need more of that. We need so much more of that. But that is how I think that is how we self-preserve and persist, and be sustainable in this work.